The morning her husband handed her divorce papers at her mother's graveside, Lorelei Vance didn't cry. She had learned, over 11 years of marriage to Daxton Price, that crying in front of him only made him feel powerful. So she stood there in the February cold black dress, catching the wind off the cemetery ridge, and she looked at the papers in his hand the same way she might look at a grocery receipt, briefly, without expression, and then away. Daxton Price, 44 years old and wearing a suit she had paid for, stood with his hand extended and his jaw set like he was doing her a favor. Behind him, close enough to touch his shoulder, was Brianna Salt, the woman who had been his assistant at Vance Capital for the past 2 years. Brianna was 29. She wore dark sunglasses and a fitted black coat that was inappropriate for a funeral and clearly chosen for something else entirely. The other mourners, Lorelei's aunt, 2 cousins she hadn't seen in years, her mother's book club friends who were mostly in their 70s, went very still. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind and the distant clatter of a groundskeeper's cart somewhere past the tree line. Lorelei's attorney, Edmund Farris, 58 years old, and the only other person who knew everything there was to know about what Lorelei actually owned, stood 3 feet to her left. He didn't move. He had told her, 2 weeks ago when they first learned what Daxton was planning, that she should let it happen. Don't stop it. Don't react. Just let him believe what he believes. She had listened. She took the papers. She folded them once and slid them into her coat pocket without reading them. Then she turned back to the grave and let the pastor finish. Daxton left before the last prayer ended. Brianna followed him, heels catching on the frozen grass. Lorelei stayed until the casket was lowered. Her mother, Ruth Vance, had died at 71 from a stroke, quickly without warning, on a Tuesday afternoon while she was reading in her sunroom. The doctors said she hadn't suffered. Lorelei chose to believe them. Ruth had been the only person alive who knew the full shape of what Lorelei had built. Not even Edmund knew the earliest years, the ones that happened before there were lawyers and shell companies and LLC structures. The years when Lorelei was 24 and working 80-hour weeks out of a rented office in Nashville with a temperamental copier and a legal pad covered in numbers that kept not adding up the way she needed them to. Lorelei Vance, 38 years old at the time of her mother's funeral, was the founder and controlling shareholder of Vance Meridian Holdings, a private equity firm with $420 million in assets under management, stakes in 11 regional hotel properties, and a portfolio of commercial real estate across 4 states. She had incorporated the firm under a holding entity that used a DBA structure, which meant that most of what she owned appeared, on paper, to belong to a company called Meridian Group Partners. There was no public-facing connection between Meridian Group and Lorelei Vance unless you knew exactly where to look. Daxton didn't know where to look. He knew she had money. He knew she owned some properties. He thought she was, in his own words, which she had heard him use at a dinner party in 2021, comfortable. He said it the way people say it when they mean small. A woman with a savings account and maybe a duplex she rented out. Comfortable. Nothing that would complicate things. He had married her in 2013 when she was 27, and the firm was 3 years old and operating under a name that didn't yet mean anything to anyone. By the time it did mean something, they had already settled into the particular architecture of their marriage, one in which Daxton's career at a commercial real estate brokerage was the thing that mattered, and Lorelei's work was the thing she did in the background. From home offices and early morning calls and occasional trips, she kept brief. She had not hidden herself from him deliberately in the beginning. She had simply never found the moment to explain the whole of it, and then she realized slowly that she didn't want to, that there was something in being underestimated that felt like privacy. Like the one room in the house that was entirely hers. It took her longer than it should have to understand that Daxton wasn't just incurious about her work. He was contemptuous of it. The first time she knew something was wrong, genuinely wrong, not just the low-grade friction that accumulates in any long marriage, was in October of 2023. Daxton had come home from a work dinner with a man named Porter Segal, who was some kind of developer out of Atlanta. Lorelei had met Porter once, briefly, at a conference in Charlotte. She had found him glib and a little careless with numbers, the kind of man who talked about deals the way other people talk about sports. Daxton was in a good mood that night. He poured himself a drink in the kitchen and said, without looking at her, that Porter was putting together a hotel acquisition group and was looking for capital partners. Lorelei asked which property. Daxton named it. A mid-market business hotel in Chattanooga, 42 rooms, solid occupancy rate, price tag around $9 million. She was quiet for a moment. She already owned 34% of that hotel, had owned it for 6 years. The acquisition had been one of Meridian Group's earlier deals, handled through a sub-entity, and it had performed well. Well enough that she had used the cash flow to fund 2 subsequent purchases in Memphis. She said, carefully, that the Chattanooga market was competitive and the cap rates had been compressing. Daxton said she didn't need to worry about it. She let it go. But she called Edmund the next morning and asked him to pull everything on Porter Sagal. What Edmund found wasn't criminal. It was something closer to careless, a pattern of deals that required a certain kind of partner, the kind willing to overlook some structural messiness in exchange for a fast close. Porter had done 3 acquisitions in the past 4 years. 2 of them had resulted in limited partner disputes. 1 had gone to arbitration. Lorelei put the information in a folder and said nothing to Daxton. 6 weeks later, Daxton told her he was investing $200,000 of his own money into Porter's group. She asked him if he was certain. He said she was being negative, that she never supported anything he did, that he had spent 11 years watching her putter around with her little projects while he carried the real weight of their financial life. Little projects had generated $38 in net returns since incorporation. She had never told him this number. She didn't tell him that night either. She said fine. She told him she hoped it worked out. She went to bed. The $200,000 was gone by the following spring. By the time Brianna Salt appeared on Lorelei's radar, formally, in the way that required paying attention rather than filing away, it was January of 2025. Lorelei's office manager, a woman named Greta, who had been with Meridian Group for 9 years and had the disposition of a retired intelligence analyst, came to her one afternoon with a printed email chain. She set it on the desk without comment. The chain was between Daxton and Brianna. It had been forwarded to Greta by the office's IT contractor, who had flagged it during a routine security review. The emails were not explicit. They were careful in the way that people are careful when they know they are probably being watched, but cannot help themselves. But the meaning was clear. It had been going on for at least 8 months. Lorelei read the chain twice. She set it face down on her desk. She thanked Greta and asked her to close the door on her way out. Then she sat alone for a while. She was not surprised exactly. There is a difference between the thing you have feared and the thing you have known without admitting. But surprise and devastation are not the same. She was devastated. She had loved Daxton Price with the particular, exhausted love of someone who has spent years trying to make a relationship fit a shape it was never going to hold. And now it was over, and she had known it was over, and still the confirmation landed somewhere in her chest like a stone. She gave herself the rest of the afternoon. Then she called Edmund. Edmund Farris had been Lorelei's attorney since 2011, when he was still with a firm in Knoxville, and she was a 25-year-old bringing him documents she had drafted herself and asking him to tell her what she'd gotten wrong. He had told her back then that she had gotten almost nothing wrong, which was either a testament to her or an early sign of what he would come to understand about her, that Lorelei Vance's relationship with risk was essentially tactical. She did not take chances. She took positions. The distinction mattered now. Edmund came to her office and they talked for 3 hours. He walked her through what a divorce would mean, legally, structurally, how the holding company was insulated, what Daxton could and could not claim, what discovery would look like if he hired the right attorney. He said that because Lorelei had founded Meridian before the marriage, the firm itself was almost certainly separate property under Tennessee law. The growth and earnings during the marriage were more complicated. Lorelei listened to all of it. She asked specific questions. She took notes on a legal pad, which she would later shred. At the end of the 3 hours, she asked Edmund one question. If she did nothing, if she simply waited and let Daxton do what he was clearly building toward, how would her position change? Edmund said it wouldn't. If anything, it would strengthen. She said, good, let him move first. What Daxton was building toward, it turned out, involved 2 attorneys, a financial advisor named Colt Raines, who had a reputation for aggressive marital asset discovery, and a theory, which he had apparently been developing for some time, that Lorelei's business holdings were marital property and should be divided. He filed for divorce on February 3rd. Lorelei was notified by email at 7:14 in the morning, before she had finished her coffee. The service was arranged to occur at her mother's funeral. She thought about that for a long time afterward. The specific cruelty of the timing, the choice to do it there, in front of her mother's friends, in front of the grave. She had known Daxton for 15 years. She had watched him make choices for 15 years, and still there was something about that particular choice that told her something about him she had not fully let herself believe. He thought it would break her. He had mistaken stillness for weakness his entire marriage. The first filing in the divorce was Daxton's. His attorney, a man named Sutter, who was known in the Nashville legal community for being expensive and occasionally effective, submitted a discovery request that was, Edmund said, ambitious. They were asking for financial records going back 12 years. They had identified Meridian Group Partners as a potentially marital asset. They wanted full disclosure of all entities in which Lorelei held any ownership interest. Edmund filed the response 2 weeks later. It was 214 pages. It contained, in meticulous and unambiguous detail, the full history of Vance Meridian Holdings. Its founding date of March 2010, 2 years and 7 months before the marriage. Its original capitalization from a combination of Lorelei's personal savings and a private loan from her mother. The corporate documents showing sole founding membership, and the certified valuations, current and historical, of every asset in the portfolio. The total current valuation of all holdings under Lorelei's control, $418,600,000. The document also contained, in an appendix, a single-page summary prepared by a forensic accountant, which showed that Daxton Price had contributed exactly nothing to the founding, growth or operation of Meridian Group Partners during the course of the marriage, and had in fact benefited from Lorelei's income in 17 documented ways, including a car lease paid from a Meridian operating account in 2018, a home renovation in 2020 that Lorelei had funded entirely, and a $200,000 transfer to cover his loss on the Porter Segel deal, which she had quietly made without telling him. That last one had been her insurance. She had known even then that she might need the paper trail. She heard from her cousin Adele, who was married to a man who knew Sutter socially, that Daxton had gone pale when his attorney called him with the news, that he had said, apparently more than once, that it wasn't possible, that it couldn't be right, that there was no way Lorelei, his wife, who worked from home, who drove a 7-year-old Subaru, who always asked him to handle the reservation when they went to restaurants, because she said it made her nervous to call, owned $400 million. Lorelei drove a 7-year-old Subaru because she liked it. She had bought it with cash. The restaurant thing was real, though. She genuinely did not like making phone calls to strangers. This was something Daxton had never understood about her, that the same person who could close a $30 million real estate deal via email could find it genuinely difficult to call a restaurant and ask for a table. People were complicated. He had never bothered to learn her particular complications. The dog came in the middle of all of it. Her neighbor 2 houses down, a retired teacher named Opal who was 78 and had lived on the street for 30 years, knocked on her door one Saturday morning in March and asked if Lorelei could take in a dog temporarily. Opal's daughter in Phoenix had agreed to adopt the animal, a 2-year-old mixed breed named Birch, who had belonged to a man on the next street who'd had to go into extended care suddenly without enough time to arrange for the dog properly. Lorelei said she would take him for a few weeks. That was 4 months ago. Birch was still there. He was a medium-sized dog, tawny and serious, with a way of positioning himself just inside whatever room she was in. Never demanding attention, just present. She had not had a dog since childhood. She had not understood until now what it meant to have something alive in the house that was purely glad to see you and expected nothing but basic kindness in return. She took him to work some days. Greta, who was not generally sentimental, kept a bag of treats in the bottom drawer of her desk and denied it when asked. Edmund, who came to the office regularly throughout the spring, said once that the dog seemed to be good for her. Lorelei said she didn't know what he was talking about. Edmund did not push it. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday in April. Daxton's attorney Sutter had requested it as part of discovery. The standard procedure. They would ask her questions about the firm, about the assets, about the history of the marriage as it related to finances. Lorelei wore a grey dress she had owned for years and flat shoes and no jewelry except her watch. She arrived 7 minutes early and sat without speaking until Sutter entered the room. He was a tall man, slightly florid, with a practiced manner that suggested he expected to be the most capable person present. He reviewed his notes for a long moment before looking at her, which she understood was a choice, a small power move, an attempt to establish the terms before anything was said. She watched him with the expression she used in difficult board meetings, attentive, patient, absolutely unreadable. He began with the founding of the firm. She answered everything accurately, precisely, and without elaboration. When he asked a question that assumed something that was not true, she corrected the assumption before answering the underlying question. When he asked something she had answered already in the 214-page filing, she said she referred him to the documents submitted in discovery. After 40 minutes he shifted. He asked about Brianna Salt. She said she didn't understand the relevance. He said they were establishing the full context of the marriage. She said she understood the relevance of the divorce. She was questioning the relevance of a specific individual to questions about the firm's asset structure. He moved on. Near the end, he asked whether she had been aware that Daxton was planning to file for divorce prior to February 3rd. She said yes. He paused. He said when. She said she had been aware for approximately 3 months prior. He asked why she had not sought legal counsel during that period. She said she had. He asked why in that case she had taken no apparent action. She said she had taken exactly the action she intended to take. He had no follow-up question ready for that. She watched him look for one and then not find it, and she waited with her hands folded on this table while he reorganized his notes. The settlement discussions began in May. Sutter came in with a number, a percentage of the firm's current valuation, framed as a claim on the marital appreciation of the assets. Edmund said the number was not supported by statute and outlined, in 3 pages of argument, exactly why. There were 4 sessions. Daxton attended the last 2. Lorelei sat across the table from him for the first time since the funeral, and she looked at him the way she looked at any asset she was assessing, steadily, without sentiment, calculating the real value as opposed to the presented one. He looked tired. He had, she noticed, lost some of the particular confidence he had worn for years like a second suit. Brianna was not in the room. He said almost nothing. His attorney spoke, Edmund spoke, the mediator spoke. The numbers were discussed and adjusted and discussed again. On the second day, in the middle of a lengthy exchange about valuation methodology, Daxton looked across the table at her and said her name. Just that, Lorelei. She looked at him. He seemed to want to say something, several things, maybe. The room had that quality of a conversation that is happening underneath the one being recorded. She waited. He looked away. The final settlement was reached on a Tuesday in early June. Daxton received the marital home, which Lorelei had paid for but was titled jointly, and which she had already decided she did not want to return to, and a lump sum that accounted for his documented contributions to joint marital expenses over the course of the marriage. It was a fair number. Edmund said it was more than generous. Lorelei said she wasn't interested in being ungenerous. She was interested in being finished. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning. Edmund called her at 10:15. She was in the middle of a call with a hotel general manager in Memphis. She asked Edmund to hold on. She finished the conversation, told the GM she'd circle back with the CapEx projections by Friday, and then came back to Edmund. He said it was done. She said thank you. She meant it for more than the phone call. Birch, who had been sleeping under her desk, lifted his head when she set down the phone. She looked at him for a moment. He thumped his tail once against the floor and then rested his chin back on his paws. She had been thinking, for weeks, about the first deal she had ever closed. A small mixed-use property in East Nashville, 2010, when the firm was barely a year old and she was still doing her own property walkthroughs because she couldn't afford to pay anyone else to do them. She had walked through that building on a January morning with a flashlight and a legal pad, cataloging everything that was wrong with it, and she had thought, this is fixable. All of it is fixable. You just have to be willing to stay with it long enough. She had thought that about the marriage too, for a long time. She had thought that about Daxton. She understood now that it was not the same thing. Properties were fixable. Some things were not properties. The morning she moved into the new office, a leased suite on the 14th floor of a building she was in the process of acquiring, she used the main entrance for the first time. She had been using the side entrance during the build-out, taking the freight elevator to avoid the construction traffic. The lobby had been finished the week before. Marble floors, clean lines, a reception desk in pale wood, nothing ostentatious. She had been specific about that. Greta was already at the front desk when Lorelei came through the glass doors with Birch on a leash. Greta looked at the dog. Lorelei said he was officially a permanent addition. Greta opened the bottom drawer of her desk without comment and produced the bag of treats. Birch sat immediately, without being asked. Edmund arrived at 9 for a standing review. He set his bag down, accepted a coffee from the small kitchen, and looked around at the new space with the expression of a man who'd been practicing law for 30 years and had seen people come through worse than this and build something worth seeing on the other side. He said it looked good. Lorelei was standing at the window. The city spread out below in the particular quality of early morning light that makes everything seem more possible than it was the night before. She said she thought so too. Downstairs, 14 floors below, Daxton Price was somewhere in the city doing whatever came next for him. Living in the house, working the brokerage, building whatever story he would tell about what had happened to his marriage and why. She did not know the story he was telling. She had decided, sometime in the long winter between the funeral and the settlement, that she did not need to. She turned away from the window. There was a 9 o'clock call with a contractor in Knoxville and a property walkthrough scheduled for Friday and a draft partnership agreement waiting in her inbox that needed to be reviewed before the end of the week. She sat down at her desk. Birch settled at her feet. She picked up the phone and dialed in.